Hello everyone, I'm Malcolm Payne, an international master from England, and I've recorded this video in order to explain to you how you can use the DecodeChess app to unravel the mysteries of the games of even the greatest players. What we're going to look at today is the second game of the World Chess Championship match being played at Dubai Expo 2020, a year late of course, between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. The second game was interesting because the first game had been a slightly tense draw that you can also see analysed with DecodeChess by me on a different video, and we were all waiting to see what Carlsen would choose to play against Nepomniachtchi with the white pieces, because the second game was his first game with the white pieces. And as you can see, after 5 moves they reached this typical position from the Catalan. It was a Catalan opening. Catalan is essentially a Queen's Gambit, but one where white fianchettos his bishop on g2. Let's start from move 1 and see how they reach this. Carlsen opened with d4, and Nepomniachtchi played e6, which is a little bit of a foxy move because one never knows. Black might go d5 and play a Queen's Gambit. Black might play c5 and a Benoni, although something as fast and loose as a Benoni, or a modern Benoni in this case, in the World Championship is pretty unlikely. I can't remember too many since Bobby Fischer used it to whack Boris Spassky at Reykjavik in 1972. It's considered a little bit risky, modern Benoni. There is, of course, if white goes knight f3, black might play also bishop b4, check the Bogo Indian defense, or b6. But okay, that's not strictly relevant to our theme. Nepo played d5, and this is where Magnus could have gone knight c3 along the lines of the Queen's Gambit, but he went for the Catalan. And this is all very, very standard stuff. And at this point, black has to make a choice. Does he play super solidly with c6, trying to build a barrier against the bishop? Does he maybe move his knight to here with a view to possibly playing solidly with c6 later? Does he look at lines involving b6? Or does he just take this pawn? Which is, if you like, a sort of a natural counter to the fact that this white bishop isn't on this diagonal anymore. It's sort of saying, well, you let me take it, I'm going to take it. And there are a variety of moves here. Queen c2, the one that Magnus played, is the most common. You can also play this crazy one, which I've tried once or twice. The computer doesn't like it, but hey, as we so often say, it's humans who are playing the games. So Queen c2, and this just threatens to take the pawn back. And black has a variety of ideas here. He can go a6 in order to play the move b5 and then bishop b7. That's a very, very long line of theory. Or he can play super sharply. Super sharply. Well, he went b5. That's as sharp as it gets. He's just trying to keep this extra pawn. And now the main line is a4. But I suspect Magnus was trying to avoid what is a super trendy line at the moment, which is bishop b7. And this must be quite an unusual or weird looking move for a beginning or improving player to see, because after a takes b5, hasn't black just, well, ruined his pawn structure? Given white a pawn back and in some sort of trouble? Well, this is where asking DecodeChess can actually be quite helpful, because there is actually quite a sensible move for black here, quite a good move. Let's ask the program what it is. And it comes up with a6, which looks odd, but as it says, it's beneficial because it threatens to play a takes b5. It's better than the alternatives. And after pawn takes pawn, it advocates knight takes pawn, and it's telling you all these interesting things that this knight move does. And it's actually setting up an immediate threat of going knight b4, hitting the queen, and also whoosh, hitting the rook. This is a very sharp and interesting position. We won't go there now, but it just shows you how you can use the program to try and understand variations that are not so easy to follow in the first instance. Well, Magnus wanted to avoid all of that stuff, So after b5, he went knight e5. An obvious move, attacking the black rook in the corner with his bishop. And there's a very long line of theory that goes queen takes d4, bishop takes a8, queen takes e5. But in a world championship match, you're never going to go into something like that without having looked at it first, because you're just asking to walk into your opponent's preparation. So, c6 was played. And now the program tells us that a4 is beneficial. And it's right, it threatens the black pawn on b5. And you can see all these arrows showing you what exactly is going on here. Quite interesting that in the Catalan, white often wants to play bishop g5 and take f6. The reason for that is, as you'll see later, the program will show even more clearly, that it enables you to take complete control of e4, amongst other things, and sometimes it also weakens black's c5 square. So knight d5 was played, very logical move, blocking the diagonal, and as we'll see, enabling black to play the move pawn to f6, kicking the white knight. And this was a very, very interesting moment, and a moment when I want to interrogate DecodeChess about what it thinks that black's best move here is. And what DecodeChess does is it uses the Stockfish engine, but then describes to you in natural language what it means. So it's so much better than just looking at a game with an engine. When you get a few variations which are hard to distinguish between each other from each other, then you get an assessment with a little number like 0.5, 0.6, but what does it actually mean? So Decode here says that the best move for black is b4. Hitting the knight, threatens bc3, enables b3, nice little arrow there showing you, and also supports playing bishop takes c4 by making way through b5, by which it's showing you that the bishop can come to a6 and hold this extra pawn. And of course it escapes capture by the white pawn. And after knight e4, bishop a6, this is clearly something that Nepomniachtchi considered, and this is more match strategy than chess strategy. I'm pretty sure that in this position Carlsen would have played this move, hitting the bishop, and this is a very sharp, unclear, unbalanced position, which he's looked at home, and Nepomniachtchi hasn't looked at home. He hasn't looked at it. So, without going into the details of who is better and why, if you're playing a World Championship match, you're just not going to touch something that your opponent might have looked at in such detail if it's so sharp. So we'll go back to the game, but it's just interesting that that's what Decode thinks was best is b4, and maybe objectively it's best, but Nepomniachtchi played queen d7, which is also a pretty sensible move. The points of queen d7 are covering e6, covering b5, and also covering b7. Let's continue through the game. Carlsen, of course, takes the centre. This is most of his compensation for the pawn, but what it does allow Nepomniachtchi to do is put this enormous knight in on d3. But white is still better. But it would be very difficult, I think, to know what white's best move is here. So I interrogated DecodeChess again, and it came up with the move Carlsen played, e5. Why is e5 good? Well, first of all, it threatens to play e takes f6, which further weakens black's king. And secondly, of course, it unleashes the Catalan bishop. What's also helpful is that it's listing here black's major threats. Pawn to b4, which does all sorts of things, and also knight to a6, which, as we'll see in the game, Carlsen somewhat underestimated. So e5, great move from Carlsen. As Decode also said, by the way, it allows this knight to come into this beautiful square. Bishop came to b7, black has to cover the diagonal. E takes f6. Bishop takes f6. And now, what should white do? I mean, he can clearly develop pieces. Maybe develop his bishop. Maybe throw a knight in on e5. Difficult to know, but Decode comes up with the move that Carlsen played, knight e4. And knight e4 is a good move because it threatens the black bishop on f6, gets out of the way of the pawn rush coming down on the queen side, guards c5, absolutely. I mean, you get a knight on that square, it will be beautiful. It also potentially takes off quite a good bishop too. The other thing that it does, which is quite interesting, is it talks about threatening to play b3. What it means by that, I think, is what you absolutely don't want to allow. I mean, just for the sake of argument, I'm just gonna show this. Is you don't want to allow something like this. This is very unpleasant. Very, very, very unpleasant. If black gets those two pawns in there, that's a permanent advantage for him positionally. Never mind the exact tactics going on here. That's not what I'm trying to demonstrate. I'm trying to explain why Decode is saying that b3 is a threat, and that's the point. You see that after knight e4, pawn to b4 is a fairly pointless move because it doesn't threaten pawn to c3 because it's not, or at least threatens pawn to c3. It won't allow pawn to c3 because it's not gaining a tempo on the knight. So Decode's giving us a lot of insight there into the reason why knight e4, as played by Carlsen, was the best move. So, let's get that on the main variation, and black went knight a6. It's funny, my comment in this position was that black has one magnificently placed piece on d3, but the rest of his pieces aren't that great. And here, Carlsen made a big mistake. He went knight e5. And it's funny, when you've got a guy who's potentially the ghost, it's hard for people to sometimes come to terms with the idea that he can play a really bad move. And I've had a lot of people asking me about this game saying, well, I really thought that exchange sacrifice by Carlsen was very interesting. He got all sorts of attacking chances. Well, sorry to disappoint you, everyone, but actually, it was a blunder. It just wasn't, as we'll see. Bishop takes, pawn takes, knight c5. And all of a sudden, you can see that black's got this rather nasty threat of knight to b3. Very, very unpleasant. And always remember, of course, that black is a pawn up. So if white tries to avoid material loss in this way, actually, just something like queen f7, knight can come into d3 or b3 later, and black has got a clear extra pawn here. At some point he'll play the move a6, he'll shift his knight, he'll play c5, weaken white's king, and just have a clear pawn advantage with 4b2 on the queen side. So Carlsen had a think after knight c5, he clearly overlooked all the consequences, and he played knight in. At least he's got his own fantastically placed piece in the heart of black's position. Unfortunately, he has to give up some material. And I think Carlsen's next move was a mistake, so I asked Decode what the best move here was. And it came up with 20 bishop e3, just developing a piece. And why does it say it's good? Well, first of all, it's potentially threatening a takes b5 because a7 will be on prise now. It allows the rook on f1 to control a1. Well, another way of putting that would saying it just enables it to recapture. Yep, enables rook takes a1. And it supports the pawn on f2, which is vulnerable in some variations. And rather pointedly, Decode remarks bishop e3 is better than the alternative rook b1. Yes, that's what the world champion played. And now, he was in some trouble because he's the exchange and a pawn down. And although he's got some clear compensation with a beautifully placed knight, a beautiful bishop, and generally more activity, that's a lot of material. A lot of material. And Decode, again, is explaining in natural language why rook ab8, the move played by Nepomniachtchi, is good. It threatens to play bishop a8. Now, the point of that is that if the bishop gets to a8, it won't be pinned anymore, because it gets out of the way of this knight and this bishop, and that means that black can play the highly desirable pawn c5, just uncorking his entire position. His worst piece is exchanged, his pawns become mobile, he's having a great time. So, rook ab8, excellent move. I also thought that a6 was possible, by the way, because I think black's going to have to do that at some point. But okay. Carlsen responded after rook ab8. with rook d1. He's trying to create some threats on the d-file, and Nepo continued with his plan. Bishop a8. Very, very logical. And now Magnus played this move. And this is the move that saved him. And I'm going to give you a little quiz question in a minute about all of this. But Nepo's next move was kind of a panic reaction. I think suddenly he noticed that all four white pieces could start attacking on the king side. And so he decided he wanted to open the b file as fast as he possibly can to get some counterplay. But this was a mistake. Your question today in this quiz is what should happen after b takes a4. I'll give you 20 seconds to work out how white continues. What's white's best move here? Well, it's quite fun. He takes here, and I think it was the sight of all these variations that got Nepo really worried. Rook d4, threatening rook h4 and mate. And it seems like black's best variation is to go here, and my analysis then suggested that the game is probably a draw. Probably best play, because you can see that potentially white's playing c5, black, excuse me, is playing c5 and delivering checkmate, so white probably has to bail here. Probably has to bail. But okay, let's just get back to the game. Bishop a8, bishop e4, and Nepo played now c3. Bit of a panicky move, but he wants to create counterplay on the b file if he can at some point by opening it. Carlsen attacked the h7 pawn. Nepo defended it. Carlsen took back. And all of a sudden, I don't know, it just looks to me like it's black who is suffering a little bit. He hasn't yet fixed the problem of his bishop on a8. If he plays the move pawn to c5, he'll lose his b5 pawn. And now that he's had to play g6, this knight has got more possibilities. And from here on, people started to think, well, maybe Magnus might even come good here. I just wondered whether Nepo was still in the game, and Decode says yes, that after queen g7, let's play that move. Queen g7 is good because it supports the g6 pawn, threatens the pawn on e5, and of course gets out the way of the rook because there are some nasty discoveries. So I'm surprised actually that Nepo didn't find queen g7, but he was clearly very keen on opening the b file. So he played b takes a4. And now Carlsen gets even more active. All of his pieces are doing very, very, very well indeed. c5. Finally, black rids himself of that hopeless bishop. Of course, Carlsen doesn't want to swap queens. Now knight f6 check is a threat. King gets out of the way. Knight hops in back to that beautiful square, keeping f7 under control. Rook b6. And now Nepo figured that if he could swap rooks, he'd probably be fine. And that's true in most variations. It's a good general point, actually, that if you've got an extra exchange, it's often good to remove your opponent's rook, because then he hasn't got a rook. It's like the advantage of having two rooks against one isn't as much as the advantage of having one against zero, because there's certain types of move that your opponent just can't make, e.g. ones that go up and down and side to side. Strange thing, but that's how it is. It's logical to swap rooks when you're the exchange up most of the time. So this is a crucial position for Carlsen. He's now somehow managed to go from being 1 pawn down to 1 pawn up, and he's still got this mighty knight as compensation for the exchange. But how do you proceed? How do you strengthen the white position? So this, I thought, was a perfect time to ask DecodeChess to try and unravel the mysteries of this one, because it's very, very hard to know what to do. There's no big hitting tactic for white here. It's just, how can we strengthen and improve our position? And Carlsen played King G2, and when you interrogate Decode, it says, well, yeah, King G2 is a good move. Why? Because Queen D4 is possible at some point. Well, it's possible before King G2, but it'll be enhanced now potentially. The main thing is, stops Rook B1 from being check, and it enables King H3. Now, why is King H3 potentially good? Well, because it avoids queen swaps on the long diagonal. Queen C6 check, for example, might be annoying. It escapes the black rook, and because the white rook no longer needs to defend B1 in some circumstances, possibly on a good day, it'll be able to take on A7. And this is indeed what happened. King G2 was played. Nepo played A6 to cover his A6 pawn, and just quite an interesting variation here is, logically, white would not want to have the queen swapped off when he's exchanged down, but here, because he's so active, this position is actually very, very good for white. H7 is attacked, E6 is attacked, and there's a nasty threat of knight E4 to F6 taking the H7 pawn. So this position, I think, might be quite unpleasant for black to defend. So Nepo avoided it and played this move A6. King H3. Getting out of the way now, because now that the pawn on A7 isn't hanging after Queen C6 check, of course, we don't want to allow Queen C6 check. And now this was the kind of position you sort of thought, well, maybe Carlsen is squeezing now. If you can get the move C5 in, he'll be putting him under a bit more pressure. But as Magnus said, my time was ticking down. I couldn't see a way of comfortably improving my position, so I headed for a draw. So I'll just show you the rest of the moves. This allows this idea that Nepo had clearly been angling for a while, and after a full sequence of moves in which white wins a pawn but is forced to allow a rook ending, which is just a draw, the game ended peacefully. I'll just show you the remaining moves. No, of course I'm not swapping rooks. Nice move, because pawn takes pawn is an easy 2v1 draw. And at the right moment, you have to activate your rook. This is always the point in defending these endings. You've got to activate your rook at the right moment. White's threatening to play G4 and G5 and push. But because you've got your rook behind, you can just do some very, very annoying checks. And so the game ended. Black just threatens to check along the rank. And a draw was agreed. So I hope that game and the analysis in this video has helped you, if you like, decode. We want to show you how to use the program to the best effect to improve your chess, to understand the moves of the great players, and become a better chess player. Well, thanks for watching this chess video. I'm Malcolm Payne, recording it from London. Looking forward to the third game. Bye for now.